started. Thank you all for joining us for the fall community update on the Northern Bus Garage Reconstruction Project. This meeting is recorded so that others who are unable to attend can watch the recording from the website. Next slide, please. Back one slide. So this is a fully virtual meeting. We ask that you please, so that we can both capture them and make sure that we get all questions answered, that you type your questions in the chat. It is not required that you type your your questions into the chat though. You can simply raise your hand and we will bring you off mute. The way to raise a hand is to go to the reactions, and within reactions, you'll see the raise hand function. You can also type your name in the chat, which will indicate that you have a question. We have designated Q&A moments or Q&A sessions at the end of each section in this presentation. So you feel free to type your question, raise your hand, type, I have a question, and we will answer your question or bring you off mute at the appropriate time during that Q&A period. Next slide. So for today's meeting, we will go through introductions. We have an additional component, which is the Interpretive Wayside Exhibit Draft Plan, environmental overview, which will be covered today. Then we'll return to our construction overview. And again, that's two different parts. There's an Interpretive Wayside Exhibit Draft Plan. Then there's the environmental overview, the construction overview, the project review and updates, and then what to expect. Seems like the lines are a little off separating those, but I did want to kind of make sure those are all the different sections that we'll be covering today during this update. So we have a lot of information. Hopefully we'll be able to get through it all. And with that, I'll turn it over to Maya to do introductions. Good evening, Maya.
Good evening, Denzel. Thank you. And good evening, Northern community members. Thank you for sharing your time with us this evening to bring you the latest updates and answer your questions from our Northern Bus Garage Reconstruction Project. Next slide, please. My name is Maya Nino. I'm the Senior Program Manager with WMATA's Project Delivery Office. With me this evening is Mr. Tom Robinson, the PMCM Project Manager, Mr. John Munson, the Contractor PMs with Clark, Mr. Jim Ash, WMATA's Environmental Coordinator, and Mr. Jeff Winstill, WMATA's Architectural Historian. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jeff Winstill for the Interpretive Wayside Exhibit Draft Plan presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. As Maya said, my name is Jeff Winstill. I am WMATA's Architectural Historian, and I'm here to talk tonight about the Interpretive Wayside Exhibit Plan and hopefully give you an understanding of what that's all about. Next slide, please. Okay, the real purpose of my little presentation tonight is to get the community to provide us with some feedback about these exhibits that we are planning to put in, which will focus on the history of the Northern Bus Garage and the community as well. As a part of this project, I've conducted some oral histories, and I'm asking, I will probably ask several times, for community photographs, especially if anybody has photographs of people working in the Northern Bus Garage, and they don't have to be 100 years old. I'm just looking for some, real live photographs that will help convey the history of the building. I'm also hoping that you'll take the time to review our implementation plan, which is a draft and contains kind of the text that will go on the exhibit panels as well as the photographs. There will be a link to the plan that will be on the project webpage. I think it's on there now. So if you could take the time to look at that, that would be appreciated. A part of the plan includes some design concepts for exhibits that we're going to put in the community room. Now, the community room is the area that's in the red circle there. As you can see, it's a big building, and this is a little part of it, but it is dedicated to the community, and we want to have input from all of you about what you want to see on the walls in terms of interpreting the history of the community and the building. Next slide, please. A little background. Why are we doing this? Well, the Northern Bus Garage is a historic building. It was built in 1906. It was built as a streetcar barn. And with historic buildings, there's often preservation regulations. I don't want to get into the weeds on all this, so let's just breeze through this if we can. Because we're using federal money, we have to follow Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And because we are making major alterations to the building, we have an adverse effect to the historic property. So we had to come up with an agreement with the Historic Preservation Office that says what we can do to help preserve some of the history that is left and still make it a functioning, part of the transit system. This agreement has two kind of entities. One is signatory parties, which are limited to just WMATA, the Federal Transit Administration, which is giving us considerable funds for this project, and the DC State Historic Preservation Office, which kind of enforces the regulations. In addition to the signatory parties, this agreement has consulting parties. And these are organizations in the community that have asked to be a part of the process of determining what should be done to help preserve the history of the building. And you can see there are 4 listed there. Really looking for feedback from those organizations if you're representing one of them, please. And also, just to let you know what we agreed to do in terms of this memorandum of agreement. There are several things. We're going to be replacing all the windows that are inappropriate. We are kind of building up the structural foundation for the facade, which is a really historic, interesting part of the building. And we're doing these wayside exhibits, hopefully to educate people about the history of the building and why it's considered historically significant. We're planning on doing 3 double-sided exterior exhibit panels, and you can see in the image there that says Cultural Tourism DC. Maybe you've seen these around town. They're going to be like that. And we're also doing in the community room 5 interior exhibit panels. Next slide, please. There are some requirements, and these are some things that the DC State Historic Preservation Office wanted. They wanted the exhibit panels to talk about the historic and architectural significance of this building, which is technically Italian Renaissance revival. They also wanted some history of the DC streetcar system. DC was a very streetcar dependent city for quite a while. So they want to convey that type of history and social history, including African-American history. As this neighborhood developed after the streetcar barn was built, a lot of restrictive covenants were placed on properties. And also there was discriminatory hiring practices at what was then the Capital Transit Company. And that's a part of the history of the building that we're going to try and cover. Next slide. So we've been working on this for a few months. We've done some, outreach to organizations that would be helpful in reviewing what we've put together. And we've been doing some research. You can see kind of the list of people that we've contacted. The National Capitol Trolley Museum in Silver Spring, the Mapping Segregation Project that the DC, I think the DC History Center initiated. I've conducted 3 oral histories and written this project implementation plan, and that includes some preliminary design concepts for the community room. Next slide. What do we have yet to do? We need to get your thoughts about the plans for the exhibit panels. And if you have any stories that you would like to share, old newspaper clippings, photographs. As I said before, we would, be happy to work with them. We have to, have all these images on these panels for it to be interesting. And please email your thoughts and comments to the address you can see on the screen, hopefully. We're having a month for when the comment period is open. So that will end on December 13th. The community room concept designs, we're planning on having a town hall. And this is something that we're in the process of developing and setting up a event, inviting community members to choose from various formats and give us some input. As I said, the comment period is 4 weeks. So hopefully you can get your thoughts down and email them to us before Christmas. Next slide. Thank you for your attention, and please go to the project webpage and learn more about this project and how you can help to make it something that you will like having in your community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a couple of questions. And again, if you have additional questions, please write them in the chat or raise your hand using the reaction feature, and we will be sure to get to it. So I have a question I want to kind of address, there are a couple of questions, and I'm just trying to figure out if it's best to do what I perceive as, the 106 questions or the wayfinding. So I think we have a question from Commissioner Zalunda asking, how are or were consulting parties determined? And if someone is interested in becoming a consulting party, what would they need to do to become one?
Well, the consulting parties were determined by, we had several public meetings when we were discussing the project at the preliminary stages. And basically we were told, we told the public that if they wanted to be a part of this process, they could simply write a letter to the signatories, the FTA and the DC SHPO, requesting consulting party status. And everybody that wrote a letter requesting that status was granted that status. And hopefully they were able to participate in developing how the agreement turned out. Technically, we're not at a point where we can identify new consulting parties, but if you have comments, please share them, and they will be, read and considered. It's not closed, I should say, in terms of providing input.
Thank you, Justin. What I think you're saying is the consulting party process designation part of the process is not current, but you are still looking for individuals to provide comment to be considered in the final design. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. There are a couple of comments I want to cover, and then we can get to which are, I would like to see a retired WMATA employee honored, Mr. Herb Leonard. He was extremely helpful to residents during the earlier years. There's another comment, we would like to see bright and creative lighting along the pathway for resident passing along Decatur and Iowa Avenue to 14th Street. I think there's a walkway. There are a couple of other questions, and they may be more appropriate for the construction piece. One is, will there be parking for Metro staff at the new site, which is a construction question. You don't have to answer that, Jeff. And then where can I get or find a drawing and or list of what will be in the completed building? I am going to put a lot of that information is on the project website. I've put the project website link there. And I invite Ms. Johnson to, take a look. If there's some additional questions, or if you're not able to find anything, please, ask the question again during the construction overview, or if there's a more specific question, we will get an answer to that. So will there be parking? Like to see bright and creative lighting. Where can we find additional drawings? Consulting party determination, and honoring Mr. Herb. That appears to be all the questions for this section. So thank you, Jeff. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff. I also want to acknowledge that we have representatives from DOEE who have joined. Thank you for joining. And with that, good evening, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right, slide, please. Thank you, Donzel. We've received a number of questions and some suggestions. We provide an overview of the environmental remediation approach. And so I'm going to spend a good portion of this evening going into the environmental remediation strategy, the process, how we look at things, where we are, and give you a sense, hopefully, of where this might be going. In understanding this process, we look at environmental remediation through 5 different filters, if you will. Those 5 filters are shown here. First, we look at the site history, that is what happened at the site over the course of its usage. Then we look at what contaminants might be present and try to identify where they are within the environment. That's referred to as the nature and extent of contamination. Once we understand where the contaminants are in the environment, we look for what's called the fate and transport of the contaminants. Where are they going? What will happen to the contaminants within the environment? Once we have that understanding, we attempt to assess the risk associated with those contaminants in the environment. That is, what is the level of cancer risk and what is the level of non-cancer risk associated with the identified contaminants? And finally, once we understand the risk levels, we look at remediation strategies. How will we manage these contaminants in the environment? What do we do to reduce the risk to acceptable levels? Slide, please. In looking at and talking about environmental remediation, we have a number of terms that we use. I want to spend a few moments talking about those terms and providing definitions for this discussion. The first term you'll hear frequently is the term contaminant, which is a material that is present on site above naturally occurring levels. So petroleum is not a naturally occurring substance at Northern Bus Garage. So if we find that in the environment, it would be considered a contaminant. On the other hand, certain metals are naturally occurring. And so if we find them, we will then look to see what background levels for those metals might be to assess whether or not they are contaminants. The next term you'll hear me use frequently is the word aquifer. An aquifer is a geologic formation that holds water. We recognize the area from the ground surface down to bedrock as being one aquifer. We are assessing whether the fractures in the bedrock would constitute a second aquifer. But we certainly recognize the zone from the ground surface down to bedrock as being an aquifer. You'll hear me use 2 terms. I've used them in the past, but I want to spend a moment here defining them. The first one is LNAPL, which is light non-aqueous phase liquid. And LNAPL is a liquid such as diesel or gasoline that is present in the environment and it hasn't been dissolved into water. Petroleum is lighter than water and will therefore float on top of the groundwater. So if we're looking for it, and I've got a graphic I'll show you a little bit later on. If we're looking for it, we're going to look at the top of the groundwater aquifer because it will be floating on top. By comparison, then, other liquids are heavier than water, and we describe those as dense, non-aqueous phase liquids. Of note here, chlorinated solvents, such as the fluids that are used or were used in dry cleaning activities and are sometimes used as metal degreasers, were present on site. And if they're present in enough concentrations, they will sink to the bottom of the aquifer, and then they'll roll along the bedrock surface. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But DNAPLs will sink to the bottom of an aquifer. The next phrase you'll hear me use is industrial RSL, or industrial risk screening levels. And this is a contaminant screening level for risk with a target risk of 1 times 10 to the minus 6 for cancer hazards. And that's 1 in a million increased lifetime cancer risks or excess lifetime cancer risks above background levels. The other term that we will use in assessing risk is the hazard quotient of 1 for non-cancer hazards. So environmental contaminants can cause cancer, or they can have other deleterious effects on human health. And so we look at cancer risks through the excess cancer risks posed by a site. We look at non-cancer hazards by comparing them to the hazard quotient. And if we have a number greater than 1, that would signal we have a situation we need to address further. The other level that we've talked about in the past is the Rebecca Tier 1 contaminant levels. Industrial RSLs are used for non-petroleum compounds. Rebecca compounds are used for petroleum contaminants. And as we're looking at the remediation, we look for, if we've got both contaminants present, we'll look at the lowest level in assessing what the remediation targets should be. Slide, please. So if you'll notice at the bottom of the site, or the bottom of the PowerPoint, I've got the 5 phases that I talked about earlier highlighted, and that'll be a way for you to follow where we are in the various phases. The first thing we do is we look at the site history and the sources of contamination that might be present. Northern Bus Garage was opened as a bus garage in 1906, or as a car barn for the streetcars in 1906, excuse me. But over the years, it was also used for a bus garage. Once the streetcar system was discontinued, it continued to be used as a bus garage until it was closed in 2019. The underground storage tanks associated with those activities contained petroleum products. We understand that a gas station, an automotive garage, and a dry cleaning facility were located in the southern part of the property along Buchanan Avenue or Buchanan Street. This then sets up potential contaminants that might be present on site to include lead paint, asbestos, petroleum products, chlorinated solvents, and polychlorinated biphenyls. That gives us a sense, or PCBs, that gives us a sense of what we might expect to see when we start doing environmental investigations. Slide, please. We've had a number of remediation efforts on site since we've identified petroleum contamination at the site. Petroleum vapors were identified in the subgrade as early as 1984 during a geotechnical investigation. The soil was removed and a pump and treat system was operated. That treatment system continued until 1990 when it was inactivated. In 1992, we installed an in-well free product system to remove free product from the groundwater. Free product is, in this case, would have been petroleum floating on top of the groundwater table. In 1999, we had an air sparging system that was installed at the site. Air sparging puts oxygen into the subgrade with the goal of increasing remediation of the subgrade. In 2003, chlorinated solvents were identified at the site. Again, this goes back to the reported dry cleaning facility that apparently existed at the site, plus also the automobile garage that was located at the site. In 2020, our current effort was initiated. In 2023, an interim corrective action plan was approved for activities within the building footprint. Earlier this year, we submitted a baseline risk assessment. DOEE has acknowledged receipt of that, but has asked that we continue some of our investigation efforts before we finalize the levels of risk, and we are doing that. This gives us a sense of the remediation history at the site. Slide, please. So this is kind of an overview of where we are in the remediation, and I'm going to go back into the details, but this gives you a sense of where we're going long-term for the site. So that and what I'll do in the following slides after this is show you how we got to this. For activities within the building footprint, the interim corrective action plan says we'll remove contaminated soil to industrial RSLs and tier 1 levels. Those are the levels I described earlier. The contaminated soil will be sent to an authorized facility that's capable of handling those materials. We removed all tanks and related debris, the piping and such, and other contaminated materials, and those were sent to offsite to an authorized facility. As we do the construction of the new bus garage, we will install a high-density polyethylene liner and a PVC air collection network. The goal here is to collect vapors that might accumulate in the subgrade below the bus garage, prevent them from coming into the lowest level, but if they are present, we'll have a PVC network that we can remove those soil vapors, send them to a treatment facility, and then exhaust the air to the atmosphere. If we get to that point, we would have an appropriate permit from DOE for the air treatment system. What will happen is we'll finish the construction of the bus garage. We'll then collect samples from the stub ups through the lowest concrete level and determine whether we have residual petroleum vapors. Again, if those vapors are present and they're above risk levels, then we will treat that air before we discharge it. As part of our construction activities, we will add nutrients to the subgrade to enhance the bioremediation breakdown of residual contaminants. If there are any contaminants left, and there will be 2 places where we know this is the case, these nutrients will enhance the ultimate breakdown of those contaminants. Any groundwater that's been removed during construction, and we do have some dewatering systems, is treated, free product is removed, and then that water is discharged to DC Water under an existing permit from DC Water. Part of our work involves installing 7 wells within the footprint of the new bus garage for future pump and treat activities if we determine that's needed. The idea here is that the wells are designed to be big enough so that we could put pumps into those wells, pump the water up to the surface, run them through a treatment system, and then the treated water would be discharged to DC Water. We won't know that until we get the wells installed and sampled. That's the interim corrective action plan that will address activities within the footprint of the bus garage. For activities outside of the building footprint, we're installing some additional wells to confirm our understanding of the nature and extent of the groundwater contamination, if any is present. If we identify free product during those activities, we will remove that and treat that water, send the liquids to appropriate disposal facilities. We will finalize our risk assessment to establish the risk levels, and that then will be used to establish the final remediation levels for the site. Once we understand what those remediation levels are, we will develop a final corrective action plan that specifies all the remedial activities. If the risk assessment indicates, we will install a pump and treat system for groundwater contamination. DOEE in some of our discussions has suggested that it may be appropriate once we get the next round of groundwater samples completed, that we look at establishing a second interim corrective action plan to address that groundwater contamination concern. We won't know that until we get those numbers back. But that's where we're going at the end of this. Now, how did we get there? Slide, please. The first element on sampling soils from within the footprint involved a gridded area. The orange circles shown on this graphic show the areas where we collected samples, and you can see the grid pattern there as well. We collected a sample from each of those locations. The shaded areas, yellow, green, and brown, are areas where we had levels of residual contamination above the levels that we specified earlier. We did leave 2 small areas of residual contamination on site. These are below the groundwater level, and that's important because we'll still be able to treat those, but we will treat those through groundwater rather than through soil excavation. We left those areas in place because if we were to go any deeper, we would have compromised the slope stability measures, the retaining walls and such that keep the site stable. But we did leave 2 small areas of residual contamination that represents contamination above the levels that we talked about earlier. But this gives you a sense of the extensive contamination or extensive sampling that we did to verify what residual contamination is present and what has been removed. Slide, please. All right. So let's talk a little bit now about the fate and transport of these contaminants. The contaminated soil has been removed. Petroleum, being lighter than water, will float on the water, the LNAPLs. For that, we look downhill of the site to assess where that residual contamination will go. I'll have a graphic in a moment. I'll show you this in a little bit more detail. Chlorinated solvents will sink to the bottom of the aquifer and roll downhill along the surface of the bedrock. I'll show that a graphic to that. Both petroleum and chlorinated solvents will break down over time. Our nutrients will enhance this process. Finally, we did have 1 or 2 detections of PCBs at the site. That's from the electrical equipment, likely, that was associated with operating the streetcars. PCBs will attach to the soil particles, so if we remove the soil, we will remove the PCBs from the site. And that was removed during soil excavation. Slide, please. This is a graphic that shows what can happen with petroleum in the environment. And you notice that the bulk of the contamination will migrate down to the groundwater table and migrate along the top of the groundwater. There will be some that volatilizes into the soil surrounding the main plume. And some of the petroleum will dissolve into the groundwater aquifer below the oil. And we recognize that as we're doing our sampling. But this shows what an LNAPL will look like in a cross section below the bus garage. Slide, please. So, as I said earlier, chlorinated solvents behave differently in the environment, and they will go down to aquatards, but ultimately they will go down to bedrock and then roll along the surface of the bedrock. So in this graphic, the petroleum would be at the top of the groundwater table as indicated by the upside down triangle with a dashed line, and the bedrock would be at the very bottom of this graphic. Slide, please. And this is what it might look like if you have both petroleum and chlorinated solvents present at a site. You can see the oil on top and the chlorinated solvents near the bottom of the aquifer. Slide, please. So let's turn then to a northern bus garage. This is a map of the elevations of groundwater above mean sea level. If you notice in the lower left-hand corner, the 180 feet above sea level, that's where the top of the groundwater surface was. If you notice in the upper right-hand corner, the line 146 feet, again, above mean sea level. So groundwater is going to flow downhill from the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner towards Arkansas Avenue, generally speaking. It will flow at 90 degrees to the isocontours for those who want to get into the technical weeds of it. But for our purposes here, groundwater is going to flow towards Arkansas Avenue. And you'll see that that shows up when we cite a number of our wells. Slide, please. Bedrock at this site likewise tends to slope towards Arkansas Avenue, but it's got some interesting patterns here that we don't see with the groundwater. If you notice that along 14th Street, there's a dotted line. This is bedrock. It was at 170 feet above sea level. If you notice down near Iowa and Arkansas Avenue, it's down at 140 feet. So bedrock is sloping again towards Arkansas Avenue and towards Buchanan Street. But there's a little feature here that we've known about. I believe we've talked about in some of our past meetings. There is a small depression marked by 130 feet above sea level. That's an area where we might expect chlorinated solvents, particularly DNAPLs, to accumulate if they were present, because the chlorinated solvents will always go to the lowest level of the aquifer. So we have had a number of samples at that location. We have not detected DNAPLs or concentrations of chlorinated solvents at levels that suggest that DNAPLs might be present, but we continue to be mindful of the potential for it. In general, chlorinated solvents, if they're present, would tend to flow towards Arkansas and Arkansas Avenue and Buchanan Streets. Slide, please. We have a number of regulatory frameworks that govern how we manage remediation at the site. The first is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, and that has regulations for underground storage tanks as well as waste management. That is what we do with the materials once we remove it from the site. The law that's abbreviated as AHERA governs how we remediate asbestos, and all the asbestos that was present on the site has been removed. We also have DC regulations that are present that govern what we do, and those govern air pollution, dust management, asbestos management, lead in terms of lead paint and other lead sources that might be present, how we manage waste, how we manage our underground storage tanks, and how we manage our land remediation activities. Anytime we discharge water to the DC sewer system, we have to have a permit from DC Water, and we have to comply with their conditions. Slide, please. Okay. So once we have an assessment of the contaminants, what contaminants are present, where they are, and where they would be going, what will happen to them in the environment. So we know what the nature and extent of our contamination is, and we know what the fate and transport mechanisms are. We then develop a baseline risk assessment to establish the risk levels that are posed by the site. We submitted a draft baseline risk assessment earlier this fall. DOE did acknowledge receipt, but DOE asked us to amend that after we complete some of the wells that are located outside of the footprint so that they had a better picture of the risk posed by the site. Once we have the risk will focus on identifying two numbers. The first is the excess lifetime cancer risks, and that'll be measured or assessed using a risk range of anywhere, well, the target range is 1 × 10⁻⁶, meaning that there would be, at that level, you would have 1 excess cancer risk in 1 million people. 1 × 10⁻⁴ is 1 excess cancer risk in 10,000 people. DOE has said that we would be looking at a number of around 1 × 10⁻⁶. We'll look at what that risk level looks like once we complete our risk assessment and confirm that number. The other number that we look at is the hazard index of greater than 1. Levels where if we were to have a level of risk greater than 1, we would expect to have remediation. If we have a incremental lifetime cancer risk of greater than 1 × 10⁻⁴, we clearly would have a remediation activity go on. There's some, depending on the interpretation, there's a little bit of interpretation on the risk range. EPA recognizes 1 × 10⁻⁴ to 1 × 10⁻⁶. As I said, DOE has suggested the number will be closer to 1 × 10⁻⁶. We'll know more as this process continues. Once we have those risk levels, then we can look at the site to figure out what we need to do to get the site down to the risk levels that we've talked about. This will be used to set what our final remediation levels are. Slide, please. For petroleum, we know that those levels have already been specified for us by DOE. At a minimum, those will go to DOE Tier 1 Rebecca levels. For materials within the footprint of the bus garage, we will be using the US EPA industrial risk screening levels. For outside of the footprint, we will first look at the current uses, we'll look at future uses, and we'll look at temporary worker scenarios to assess the risk for each of those pathways. We'll assess the risk for cancer, we'll assess the risk for non-cancer contamination. Slide, please. And this gets us back to the strategy that I showed you earlier in the presentation. We've talked at length about the interim corrective action plan. Once we have our risk level done, we'll establish our remediation levels and we'll prepare a final corrective action plan. If necessary, there'll be like a pump and treat system to address groundwater contamination that might be leaving the site. Slide, please. I mentioned earlier that we have some soil amendments that we've put into place. You'll notice on this graphic a rectangle located near the intersection of Arkansas and Iowa Avenues. That's the area where we've added nutrients to the soil to further enhance bioremediation of contaminants in the subgrade. You'll notice that was also consistent with the area where we had some residual contamination present. Slide, please. I said earlier, we are installing 7 groundwater wells within the footprint of the future bus garage. The maroon circles with the targets on them represent the locations of those 7 wells. Those wells are, some of them have been installed, others will be installed in the coming month as we continue with construction. The idea here is that the wells are installed down gradient of the sources with the goal of understanding what contaminants might be in the site and might be leaving the site. This is for within the footprint now. Slide, please. At the same time, we're installing a number of wells around the perimeter of the site. These wells are shown with the green squares. And the idea here is to understand what contaminants might exist outside of the footprint so that we have a full understanding of the fate and transport of the contaminants as they leave the site. Slide, please. So our next steps. We will finish installing all of the wells that have been that are shown on the graphics, and we will then collect 2 rounds of samples from those wells. That will give us an understanding of the risks that might be present from the contaminants. We'll then develop a risk assessment. Those activities are in progress. We will then develop a final corrective action plan and then move to implement those corrective action plan measures. We will continue to monitor the site accordingly. As I said earlier in the presentation, there's been some suggestion, depending on the levels of contaminants we see in the groundwater, that we may have a second interim corrective action plan to deal with contamination in the groundwater. We will look at those monitoring results after the wells have been sampled. Slide, please. We will continue to coordinate with both the Underground Storage Tank Division and the Land Remediation Division at the Department of Energy and the Environment. We met with them earlier this fall, and we will continue to do that. We will continue to provide updates to the community about these activities. We do provide immediate reports to DOE in the event of unusual activities. DOE actually has a representative on site from time to time, especially during well excavation activities. I think that concludes the remediation portion. I'm going to pause that. I know there'll be a number of questions about that. I'd like to do a quick briefing of our monitoring reports so that you have a sense of that. As we look at, I'm going to brief on July and August. I understand that September's report was posted earlier today for you to take a look at, but I'm not prepared to brief on that. That I would anticipate that happening in our next community meeting. Just as an overview of the July and August reports, we do continue to have noise level threshold exceedances during project work hours and during non-work hours. We've discussed this in the past. We recognize we are in an urban environment, but we have had exceedances of the levels of our project thresholds, but they are happening at all times of the day. We did have 5 vibration threshold exceedances in July. 3 of those exceedances were associated with utility work on 14th Street, and 2 were associated with site workers bumping into the instrument. We had in the air in July, we had particulate threshold exceedances on July the 3rd. One of our monitors was inoperable July 3rd to July 4th, but we did have exceedances in the other 2. That's not surprising. That was July the 4th, and you would have expected both noise exceedances and particulate exceedances from the fireworks that are common that day. And if DM3 had been in operation during that time period, it likely would have had noise exceedances as well, or it had vibration or particulate exceedances that day as well. For August, we had 5 vibration threshold exceedances. All were associated with the utility work on 14th Street. We had 5 dust exceedance events in August. These were attributed to wind and truck traffic activities. Dust control measures were deployed following those detections. Donzel, that concludes the environmental presentation. I know that there are a number of questions. Would you lead that part of the discussion, please?
Thank you, Jim. So there have been several questions. We've been tracking them. There are a couple that aren't for this area, so I want to cover those first, and then we'll get into what we have so far. I do want to remind participants, community members, that if you would like to come off mute and ask your question directly, simply raise your hand. And the way you do that, at the bottom of the screen, they've kind of changed the symbol for it, but if you see where it says react, you click react. Once you click that, you'll see several emojis, reactions, and you'll see at the bottom of that raise hand button. If you click that, that will put your hand up. We'll know to bring you off mute so that you can ask your question directly. If that's too involved, feel free to just simply type in the chat, I have a question. We will use that as an indicator that you have a question. When we get to you in the queue, we will invite you to come off mute and ask your question. So let me kind of touch on some of the non-environmental questions first. I saw it from ANC4E. I believe that's Commissioner Zmuda. It talked about that, there was a ANC4CO2. Seems like the ANC's and the statement beyond it seems like the ANC's most immediate vicinity of the project will be most appropriate as a consulting party, especially as the neighborhood has been, the redistricting has happened and redistributed since the early days of the project. And on this project, which despite best effort, community members have not always felt heard, he would like to see the reconsidered update on the consulting parties. And Commissioner, again, what we would like to do is, as was articulated by Jeff, the determination of consultant parties was not by the project team, but by the signatories, which includes the DC State Historic Preservation Office. We will be sure to, if you can just signal if it is you, Commissioner Zmuda, sorry for that, or if it's a different commissioner, we will make sure you get the contact information so that you can raise that with the signatories. We want to make sure that that happens in a timely way. So that was one of the things I wanted to make sure that we addressed. There was a couple of other questions around, will there be park for Metro staff on the site? Short answer is yes, but you need a more detailed answer. Mr. Johnson, we can make sure that happens during the construction overview. And then will the bus barn only receive electric buses? That is a designation that it'll be 100% electric buses, the short answer. But if you need a more detailed answer, we can also visit that during the construction overview Q&A section. Also, there was a comment, kind of question from Gail, G-A-E-L, I hope I'm enunciating that right, that said, will the next administration's goal to shut down EPA affect your mitigation objectives? I think it's safe to say that question is beyond the purview or ability to answer from the project team, but what I can say that if there are any changes to the corrective action plan, either regulatorily or administratively, the community will be informed. So those are the ones that we have there. Now, Jim, I'm going to try to get into some of the actual environmental questions. And again, feel free to raise your hand, continue to type in the chat. We are capturing those questions and we will get them answered. In addition to answering them here, we will post the Q&A in the website link on the website, on the project's website. The link has been in the Q&A and we'll continue to add it at a later date for those who need to be able to reference the website. So the first question we have is, well, we also have one about idling vehicles. I'll get to that one. I think that's more of a project update, Ms. Graper. So we'll put that with the construction overview Q&A. But the first one is, how deep is the water table below street level, from Josh Hirschberg? And great to see you back engaged, Josh.
I don't have a good answer. It would be between 10 and 20 feet. There are a couple of challenges in making that assessment. The first is, as you know, the site slopes substantially from 14th Street down to Arkansas Avenue. And so it depends on which street you're measuring. The other issue is that we are pumping groundwater below the base of excavation, and so it is depressed right now. So at a static level, we don't have a good solid answer for that. But I just in general, anywhere from 10 to 20 feet below grade.
So Jim, let me answer that because I see the number framing. So I know you talked about the levels above sea level. I think you started 180 and went to 130. So that's about 50 feet change in grade. Do you know from the street level how deep that goes? I know it's 20. I guess I don't want to assume that the surface level is 180 feet. Do we know, like, is it like is it 30 feet below grade? Is it?
That's what I'm saying. I believe groundwater, the surface of groundwater naturally is somewhere between 10 and 20 feet below the street level.
Okay.
And without a more detailed analysis, that's probably the best answer I could offer at this time, Donzel.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, are these contaminants, and I think you answered this, but I want to reiterate, present on site now doing excavation, as excavation is taking place? Are we still in a contamination status?
There are some contaminants on site, yes. There are some residual contaminants up near the intersection of Arkansas and Iowa that we know are on site, and those are the ones that were too deep, essentially too deep to excavate, because we would have compromised the slope, the walls that hold the soil back. There are some residual contaminants on site. We'll get a better sense of what contaminants remain on site after we sample the wells, and that those activities will occur in the spring of 2025. But a substantial amount of the contamination was removed as we went through the excavation process.
Thank you. And again, if you need a more detailed answer, again, feel free to raise your hand or type additional questions in the chat. The next question is, are there any problems associated with using PVC? And I take it this is like subterraneously PVC piping. Is there a better solution than plastic?
We believe that PVC is the appropriate substance to use for the purpose. The PVC network is there so that we will have a network of pipes that we can remove any petroleum soil vapors that remain in the subgrade. We believe that that's the best material to use for that.
Thank you. The next is a comment, but it may be a response. There is, please address soil contamination beyond cancer risks, contamination specifically on overall human health, to include cardiovascular, pulmonary, and respiratory health. So I know you talked about, Jim, in your presentation around, the cancer risk and the determination from times 10 to the 4th power, which is 10,000 times 10 to the 6th power, which is 1,000,000. Does that incorporate, the risk around cardiovascular, pulmonary, and respiratory health?
So the way the architecture, or the way the framework for assessing risk is set up, cancer risks are covered by the first number that you mentioned. The target number there is 1 times 10 to the -6. All other risks are addressed by the hazard index, and there we're looking for a total hazards. We want to see that number below 1, so that any non cancer risks are assessed by the hazard index.
Thank you. So the next question is from Mr. Ray Bridgewater. First part, I would like to have an electronic copy of Jim Ash's entire presentation and the Q&A. It is on the site, but Mr. Bridgewater, we will make sure that you get that. The second comment he stated was, it is hard to formulate questions without having the presentation at least a week ahead of time. Again, we will continue to work to get the presentation to you as soon as possible, and more importantly, that we inform you when the presentation is available. So we will work on that, Mr. Bridgewater. Historically, you'll recall that Metro's approach is only to deal with, at best, what you said you did, not that you were cited or forced to do repairs and remediate. Mr. Bridgewater goes and said, this report is unsatisfactory. You have to consider the cancer that people are experiencing, the asthma that people are experiencing, the cardiovascular, respiratory health issues, and a danger to children, pregnant women, adults, and seniors. This is unsatisfactory. So, Mr. Bridgewater, we appreciate your comments. We want to make sure that if you want to come off mute, that we are able to give you the opportunity to speak. I see that there's a question from Cynthia Prather, and she indicated that she would like to speak. So I'm going to ask the question, give you an opportunity to answer. We're going to invite her to come off mute for any follow-up. So the question that she did post was, are the proposed remediations for the construction period and or after, are there proposed remediations for the construction period and after, or just after the construction period?
So we've already started remedial actions at the site, and we've done a number of those. We will continue the remediation activities during construction. If necessary, remediation activities will continue after construction of the bus garage is complete. I believe that answers the question, Donzel.
Yes, and so if we can bring Ms. Prather, if we can invite her to unmute and see if she has any follow-up.
No, I don't. I decided to type it in, so that's why I did that. I'll say thank you for all of this detail tonight. It does
So,
a lot, but thank
yeah,
you.
thank you. We envision that it is certainly possible that our remediation activities will go on beyond the opening date of the bus garage. And I've had some internal discussions about that. But yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ms. Prather. So the next question is from Ms. Johnson, and it asks, is the contamination airborne and thereby able to impact the current health of residents?
We have no indication of that at this point. So when we do the excavation, we try to remove the contaminants. When we opened up the soil, we tried to remove the contaminants and keep it covered so that the contaminants would not leave the site. We tried not to leave those surfaces open during construction. But at this time, the only contaminants that remain that we're aware of on site are the ones, that small amount near the intersection of Arkansas and Iowa Avenues.
All right, thank you, Jim. That looks like those are the questions at this time. Again, feel free to continue to add them. We'll get to them. If we can't get to them during the meeting, we will make sure to get them answered. Once again, I'm going to put the link to the project website in the chat. All of the presentations from all the community meetings are on the website, and this site, along with the information provided today in the environmental overview, will be added there. We provided this detailed information because it has been requested by the community. So we will continue to try to get you all more information. So at that point, with that, I will turn it over to, thank you, Jim. Turn it over to John Munson to do the project overview and construction update. Good evening.
Thanks, Donzel. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your time tonight. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with just a brief update on where everything stands on the construction progress side of things. So from an underground and foundations perspective, we have now completed all of the pile caps and foundations, the footings and everything for the new structure of the facility across the entire bus storage level, which is this lowest level that you see in the picture here. We are continuing to place the slab on grade for that bus storage level, which you also see in the photo here. So we've completed all the slab on grade on the eastern side of the job, basically the Arkansas and Iowa side of the job, if you will. And we're advancing here on the west side of the job, working from north to south. So this is looking south towards Buchanan Street. And you can see that the slab operations are getting close to the end of the site there. Once we get to the end of the site by Buchanan, we'll still have some infill operations that have to follow behind as steel erection is advanced. So that remaining slab on grade will be ongoing process for several more months and extending into next year to again follow behind steel erection. And then lastly, as part of the underground work, to support all of this slab on grade placement, we're continuing to complete any underground piping and conduit that needs to go in below the slab before we place that slab. So that work continues to support the concrete placement. Next slide, please. Next, I'll talk about the superstructure for the new building. So the last update I gave in August, we had just started steel erection. So we were in the very early throes of it. We're now much further along. We're from a total tonnage perspective, we're about 30% complete on the job. So you can see from the photo here, basically what that means is about the eastern third of the building has been installed, basically all the way from the northern limits along Iowa to the southern limits along Buchanan Street. And now the crane that you see at the south end there, the big yellow crane, has now jumped back to the north end of the site and is starting the western 2/3 of steel erection at the north end there, kind of starting along the Iowa Decatur corner there. So we will start with that and then similarly work our way back from north to south, backing out of the job. And then, as I said, as that work advances, we will then place any remaining slab on grade as the steel goes up. And then the other thing that you can also see in this photo, starting at the north end where you see kind of the shiny area there, is that we've started placing the metal deck on top of the steel framing. So that metal deck basically forms the two elevated levels for the facility. The first one being the bus maintenance level, where all the maintenance operations for the buses happen. And then the top level that you see is the car parking level, which kind of ties into one of the questions that was asked. So that top floor is not only the roof of the facility, but also serves as employee parking for the WMATA, not only the operators, but also all the mechanics and administrative staff that will work at this facility. So that deck placement is ongoing. And again, it's going to follow the same sequence as the steel that I just went over. And then you see in my last note here that preparations were ongoing to start concrete placement. So once that metal deck goes down, we then install reinforcing steel and ultimately place concrete. And then that's the finished surface that the buses and other vehicles will drive on in the facility. We actually just placed that very first slab placement today. So that happened at the northeast corner, right? Kind of upper left-hand part of the photo, again, along that Iowa Avenue side of the job. And that, again, same thing, that concrete placement will follow in the exact same sequence as steel erection and follow the decking installation. And just from a big picture perspective, steel erection will be going on through about the second quarter of next year, so into early summer timeframe. And then the remainder of the decking and concrete placement will extend for several months after that as we complete the structure for the new building. Next slide, please. All right, next I'm going to talk about where we're at with the wet utility work. So the last community meeting, I focused a lot on the sewer line installation, understanding that was certainly very front and center to the community, and with the parking impacts, we tried to be very communicative with some of what was happening there. So I am happy to report that from our last meeting, that work was completed in September. So we wrapped up right in that 8-week duration that we had originally talked about. So with that work complete for that new sewer main up from Crittenden to Decatur, The only work remaining that we have now is one of the lateral connections for an existing sewer line on Decatur Street that we have to tie in. That work was planned to already be complete, but as we were working to complete some of our final tie-ins, we identified a deviation from DC Water's as-built that required that we go back to them and rethink the plan there to make sure that we were not disrupting any active sewer service. So we've worked through that now with DC Water and have a path forward. So we're just gonna have a little bit of tweak in how we route that lateral connection. So we'll complete that work. Now that we've got approval, we will come back and complete that work after we complete the water main replacement, because that work has now started. So to limit the impacts to parking and everything in that surrounding area, again, as we've talked about in the past, we're trying to do that heel to toe. So we will come back and do that work once the water line work is wrapped up. So next, I will talk about the water main replacement. I talked about that a bit in August, but we hadn't started it. We now have started it as of the end of October. As I reported last meeting, we expect this work to take approximately 12 weeks, being done in 2 equal phases. The first one from Decatur to Crittenden, and then the second one from Crittenden to Buchanan. So right now we're working in that first phase, completing the water main replacement up through the Crittenden area. I've got, as I note here, our work hours are similar to what we had been doing for the the sewer main work. The only thing I'd note is obviously we're getting into the time of year now where sunlight is becoming sparse. So that 5:30 time frame is trickling back to closer to 5 o'clock and may eventually transition closer to 4:30 as we continue to lose daylight earlier and earlier. As I talked about in the past, and you kind of see it in the photo here, the work zone when we're doing this will occupy that northbound parking lane right up against our construction fence, and also occupy that northbound bike lane. So, but no impacts to the travel lanes and no impacts to the southbound parking lane along the retail side of the 14th Street. Next slide, please. So real quick, this is just a blow up of our maintenance of traffic plan to help with visualization. So you can actually, if you go out there now, this is effectively what you will see out there. So that green hatched area is the work zone between Decatur and Crittenden. And we've got those concrete barriers right along the edge of the bike lane to safely separate the workers from the traveling public. And when we are complete with the section up to Crittenden, this entire configuration will basically just switch over to the next block between Crittenden and Buchanan and look very similar. So again, once we're done up to Crittenden, we'll shift this down, reopen parking in this block here you see, and then close the parking in this same northbound lane between Crittenden and Buchanan. And then once all of that work is complete, we will complete the pressure testing that has to be done per DC Water's requirements. And once all that passes, we will then come back and do the permanent restoration of the pavement in the area where we had to trench for this new pipe. And all that will be done as part of that overall 12-week duration that I had talked about previously. Next slide, please. All right, and then the last wet utility project that I wanted to touch on is we have a sewer relocation that has to happen on Iowa Avenue. The start date for this is still pending at this point because we have to complete all of the sewer connections up at Decatur on 14th Street side of things that I talked about earlier. And because of that differing condition we found, and now because we're already into the water main work, that's going to push this start date out a little bit until all that other work is wrapped up. So certainly won't be happening in the next month, or really between now and the end of the year. It'll end up being in early 2025 when we're able to kind of get back out there most likely. But we can provide updates as we get closer to that. We expect the overall duration to be about 5 weeks to complete this work, and that's inclusive of the pavement restoration. This work, unlike some of what we did on 14th Street, is going to be done during non-rush hours using barrels and traffic cones to delineate our work zones. So it'll only happen during those non-rush hours between 9:30 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. And the work zone will occupy the west side of Iowa Avenue, adjacent to that Decatur intersection. So that's already a section of that Iowa Avenue area is already one-way traffic. So it'll just be a little bit narrower while we're doing that work, but we will have, as part of our traffic control plan, have flaggers there directing traffic from Delafield to Arkansas to make sure that the traffic can still safely traverse that area. And this work is happening directly in front of one of our neighbors. So we are also communicating directly with that household to make sure they are updated too, just because obviously we understand that everybody's busy and not everyone attends every one of these meetings. So we've done some separate outreach there to make sure that they are aware of what's coming here. I think that is the last of the updates for the wet utility section. Next slide, please. So next, ongoing site maintenance. So again, this is kind of the same slide that I have most months. A couple of things that I want to specifically touch on. We did have a recent inspection by DOEE of our erosion and sediment controls. Generally, everything was in good shape, but they did identify a couple issues where I think we had some material stored too close to the silt fence along the perimeter. So our team is working to correct all that and then document the corrections with DOEE to make sure we stay in compliance with our permit. And then I want to talk briefly on delivery logistics. So this is one thing that we've not only heard some concerns raised by certain community members, but also our team has recognized, just as construction continues to go vertical, our access in and out gets tighter and tighter. So we know that there's been some challenges with trucks that are sometimes queuing to get in and out of the site, and some concerns have been raised with idling on that because of that queuing that's taking place. So that is something that we continue to focus on. We've added some additional signage to address that. We've also added a staff member to be out there to continue to walk the area, look for any trucks that are not complying with idling restrictions, and address that in a timely manner. And again, what I would say is, we appreciate any time, a member of the community sees anything. We appreciate, you have the project email. Please continue to notify the project team. So obviously we want to be made aware if there's anything you see that's problematic, so that we can stay on top of those things and address them. And then lastly, on the pest control side, I just wanted to note briefly that we did have a meeting with Department of Health. They came out and looked at everything. We gave them records for the pest control that is happening and the recurring maintenance logs, just to make sure that they have that and are in agreement with the work that's being done. And so there was no issues that came out of that, but just wanted to acknowledge that did occur. Next slide, please. All right, so lastly, I'm just going to talk about the outlook for the next 3 months. So, I say Q4, this kind of spans into early 2025 as well, just based on our 3-month cadence for meetings. But looking ahead for the next 3-month span. So again, as I talked about, we'll continue the placement for the slab on grade at bus storage level, following behind the steel erection as we go there. And with that, wrapping up the last of the underground plumbing and electrical installation to support those slab placements. We will complete the water line installation on 14th Street that I talked about earlier. We will continue steel erection as well as deck installation and then concrete placement on that deck. We will start framing for the exterior walls. So that will be our vertical metal studs and sheathing that will start going up for the exterior of the building. That work will start along the Iowa side of the building and then continue down around the Arkansas Avenue side of the building. And then lastly, I did want to touch outside of construction briefly on BEB. So we have continued to work on advancing the design with WMATA on the electric bus build out for the facility and all the charging infrastructure that'll be required. We are very close to submitting our 90% design package to WMATA. So that's a major milestone for the job. That means we're very close to completion with the design. So that'll be going in the next week to WMATA for their review. And then we will also be submitting that to the Department of Buildings for the permit review to get that process started. So we're close to wrapping up the design side, and then also working with WMATA to start to figure out how we actually start to implement the construction changes, which a huge component of that will be starting to procure all the electrical equipment required to charge these buses, which, as you can imagine, has some pretty lengthy fabrication times. So that's something we're working with WMATA to figure out how we can try to expedite that process. And with that, I believe that concludes the construction update. I'll turn it back over to Donzel to start Q&A.
Thank you, John. So Josh Herzberg wrote, how late are people working tonight? It's past 7. I think he wrote this around 7:11. And there's some loud machinery still going on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So typically we are done at 7, no later than 7, and usually it's earlier with the, as I mentioned earlier, the daylight getting shorter and shorter. But on these days, as I mentioned earlier, we did make that first elevated slab placement. So when we do place concrete on days where that happens, the finishing of that concrete typically will extend beyond that window. And that is just a byproduct of the time it takes to not only place the concrete, but then concrete needs a certain amount of time to set up and start to harden before you can actually then start to trowel it and create that final finished surface. So that is work that typically will sometimes go beyond that 7 o'clock window, just out of necessity and the nature of how concrete starts to cure and harden after it's placed.
Thank you, John. So Miss Judy Graper has had her hand raised, and then she also indicated that she would like to come off mute. Her question initially was, and I think you addressed this, but I want to just give her an opportunity about the idling vehicles and what is being done about that, because it also impacts the environment. And of course, historically, idling buses as well as now idling vehicles has been an issue with the bus barn. So I think you addressed that, but I want to give Ms. Graper an opportunity to come off mute if she's still on. So if the team could invite her to unmute.
Yeah, I have unmuted. Can you
Great.
hear me?
We can.
Okay. I just am concerned that no one seems to think that's a serious issue. I mean, you did say that you have a staff member patrolling out there, but these vehicles have been very defiant, and I found that surprising that nobody seemed to think that it was an important issue.
Again, I did not. If you got the impression that it was not an important issue, that was not what I was intending to project there with my answer. So no, we do take it seriously, and that's why, again, we've taken additional measures to address it. Again, when we have vehicles queuing, they are permitted to keep their engine running as they are queuing in that line, and then periodically moving as they move up in the queue and get ready to enter the job site. But obviously, if it's somebody who's just parked, then certainly they need to be shutting their engine off. And that's what we are continuing to focus on to make sure that we comply with those regulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Graper. The next question I have is from Ms. Johnson. The brick wall that was erected years ago, which is now torn down, so again, around beyond the 14th Street footprint of the building, what new wall will be erected and what will it be constructed of?
Yeah, good question. So this is something I know that we had touched on a long time ago during the design phase of the project, but I appreciate that it was a long time ago. So I'm going to try to kind of touch on a couple things with my answer. So we are building back a new wall. It'll be a combination of both new brick, and then depending on the elevation of the building, it's sometimes brick. In other cases, it's a high performance concrete panel. So it just depends on the elevation of the building and what facade treatment it's getting, but it will be a solid wall as it was in the past. But one big difference is it will not be in the exact same alignment as what it was previously. It's being pulled further back to the south into the project site so that we can create a much wider walkway than what had been there previously. So I think before it was very narrow. It was around, I think, 3 feet, give or take. think in our permanent condition, it's going to be close to a 12-foot shared use pathway for both pedestrians and bicyclists.
Thank you, John. The next question is, and I think you touched on it, but if you provide a little more detail, how have you dealt with the community issue of pest control?
Yeah, so I know, again, I can't speak to the larger issues that have come up in the community. I know that's something, Donzel, that came up in the small group meeting with the community leaders. So I know that's something that community leaders have been meeting with the Department of Health on, but not something that the construction team is personally involved in. I can only speak to what we're doing around the perimeter of our site. So we do have controls and baited stations around the entire perimeter of our site. And that's something that we did have DOA, Department of Health, come out and review and make sure that they were in agreement with everything that we have in place, and that they did not have any further suggestions beyond what we already have in place for the construction perimeter.
Thank you, John. The next question is from Lori Emmerich. And again, I just want to invite participants, community members, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or continue to type it in the chat, and we'll bring you off mute or we'll get it answered. As Eric says, having been out of touch during the earlier meetings, can you speak to what, if any, other businesses or services will be within the project building?
Yeah. So as far as other services in the building, so I think we touched on it a little bit earlier in the presentation, but we'll have that community room that will be available for use for the community to host meetings and different things. So that was something Jeff touched on earlier in his presentation. We also have the retail component of the facility, so that spans the majority of the 14th Street historic facade. So there, we've got between the historic building that's there, the 2-story administration building, and then also the space directly behind the historic facade will be designated retail space. Exactly how that gets broken up and how many tenants go in it is something that is still to be worked out by WMATA and their real estate group, and obviously working with different potential tenants and figuring out what is most beneficial, in terms of getting tenants, long-term tenants that would be interested in those spaces. So that's still being worked out, but there will be a large retail component there. And then we lastly do have a small office on the north end that I believe will be occupied by Uptown Main Street as part of their outreach efforts and support of the local businesses.
Thank you. So revisiting and getting more specific with the operational hours, Mr. Erzberg indicated didn't answer the question. How late will you be working on days like this, whether it's concrete work or other, and how late are you permitted to work on the project?
Yeah, so I apologize. I wasn't trying to be elusive with my answer, but I guess what I am trying to say is that because of the way the concrete sets up, it's a very difficult question to answer in terms of how late. It really, again, depends on how the concrete sets up and how long it takes to be able to physically get finishers on that slab and be able to complete the finishing of the concrete surface. And that is very hard to predict. And then obviously weather is a huge factor. So as it gets colder, concrete typically takes longer to set up. So that's something I can circle back with our team and try to provide a better answer to you on. But I also, don't want to provide a set time frame off the top of my head, because again, I think there's a lot of factors that go into that.
So I appreciate around the work specific. I guess the other part of the question, maybe I didn't answer correctly. Are there work time frame limitations placed on the project?
Yes. Yeah. So generally speaking, yeah, our hours are from 7 to 7. Yep. And that is what we typically abide by. Again, when it comes to finishing the concrete slabs, that is something that, again, we're really beholden to how the concrete sets up. So that is something that can sometimes extend outside of those hours.
Okay, so it looks like Josh wants to go ahead and follow up directly so we can invite him to come off mute. Josh, are you off mute? There you are.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so what you're saying is your permit hours are 7 to 7, but you work outside of your permit hours?
Yeah, what I'm saying is when it comes to finishing the concrete, there is a need to go beyond that just because it physically, again, even if we start work at 7, because of the way the nature of how concrete sets up and those things, we can't physically complete the work in a 12-hour time span. So this is a pretty common thing in the construction industry. I can do a little bit more research and circle back on how that's normally handled in terms of the noise regulations, because I certainly appreciate what your question is. And I know what you're trying to ask. And I would have to do a little bit more research to understand how that is typically addressed.
Thanks, John. I think I saw you come on camera. I think you want to have a.
Yeah, I just, I think in this case, John, we obviously wanted to start earlier and we had a delay with a concrete delivery, which obviously pushed us. So we definitely tried to work within that window. Unfortunately, we had a situation today, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the delivery of the concrete was delayed, which is obviously delaying us finishing. So we'll definitely try to stick with the window. Unfortunately, there was an issue this morning starting that activity. So just want to add to that.
Thank you. Well, thank you, John. So I want to, because I was just honoring the time, and Josh, I hope that got your question answered. If not, then we can definitely follow up. But I wanted to make sure that we kind of got into our final section, and then there is a Q&A that we can kind of check back. But I think, the final answer there is the expectation 7 to 7, their exceptions. I think everyone hears you clearly, Josh, around is that exception permitted or is that exception taken? And so what I want to do is get to what to expect for 2024 and beyond. Tom, good evening.
All right. Good evening. 2024 and beyond, John covered it well. More of the same with regard to the structure, elevated decks, concrete. The fit out for mechanical systems will be occurring. Touched on the BEB design. Delivery of that is imminent, hopefully by the end of the week. That is the final design component of the structure, or final major design component of the structure. We're incorporating that into the work as it progresses. So that's the upcoming work. Follow with the finishes. Early spring, probably see some finishes of the exterior of the building, and everything will be under wraps at that point with continued activity through the upcoming years. We're on schedule right now for May of 2027, with the caveat we have to incorporate the battery electric bus component. Every effort's being maintained to get that done to mitigate any delay. So the impact of that is kind of driven by supply and demand. There's other people converting to battery electric bus, so we're in queue with several suppliers and trying to get our equipment as early as we can. So that's where we're headed in the next few quarters. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Next slide, please. Did you want to cover?
I'll cover it.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. So for the last slide, we just want to remind everyone, if you're new to our community meetings, you're welcome. Please reach out to our website, wamar.com/Northern Bus Garage. There's a lot of information out there in terms of newsletters, previous presentations, additional documentations, reporting. So there's a lot of information, and we're more than happy to help you if you have any questions about any information there. As well, you can always reach out to our email address, which is dedicated for the project. If you have any questions in between community meetings, our email address is listed here, mcap_NBG_reconstruction_project@wamar.com. And lastly, we'll be announcing the next community meeting as we get closer to the winter timeframe.
Thank you, Maya.
Absolutely.
And we also, so just so we can kind of make sure that we're kind of presenting these meetings in response to the community, there's a quick 1-minute online survey. If you could, that was placed in the chat. You could please click the link, fill that out. We greatly appreciate it so that we can continue to improve the meeting process. Next slide. So if there are any final questions or concluding questions we would like to try to get answered, and then we'll end the meeting. So please feel free at this time to type them in the chat, raise your hand, and we will bring you off mute. Any closing questions? All right, seeing none, thank you all so much for joining us. As Maya indicated, we will inform you of the next quarterly meeting as the dates gets closer. And thank you for staying with us. This was a longer than normal meeting, but hopefully information you all found valuable. Thank you so much, and have a safe evening and good night.